How do you break a princess? Do you take her crown, her mother, her name? Or do you hand her a pen and a document and make her declare to the world that her own birth was a sin? The story of Mary Tudor, England's first Queen Regnant, begins not with a coronation, but with an act of profound, soul-crushing humiliation. In the year 1536, at the age of 20, Mary was cornered. Her father, the formidable King Henry VIII, had moved heaven and earth to annul his marriage to her mother, Catherine of Aragon, all for the charms of Anne Boleyn. He had broken with the Pope, declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, and in doing so had rendered his first marriage invalid. This meant Mary, once the celebrated jewel of the kingdom, the Princess of Wales, was now officially a bastard, the Lady Mary. And now he demanded she sign the paper that confirmed it. What is more terrifying, to betray your faith or your family? For Mary, they were one and the same. To sign was to accept her mother was a royal mistress, and she, the product of incest in the eyes of the new law. To refuse was to court a charge of high treason, and the Tudors didn't just threaten execution, they perfected it. The executioner's axe loomed large in the Tudor imagination. It was the ultimate tool of statecraft. For months, Mary resisted, her defiance a silent monument to her mother's memory. She was her mother's daughter, a descendant of Isabella of Castile, a woman who knew a thing or two about power and faith. But Henry's pressure was relentless, a psychological siege designed to starve her of all hope. His agents, led by the ruthless Thomas Cromwell, whispered threats in her ear. Her friends were arrested, her servants dismissed. She was isolated, sick and terrified, living under the shadow of the woman who had replaced her mother, Queen Anne, a woman she was now forced to call Queen. The world had turned upside down. The certainties of her youth, her divine right, her father's love, her place in the world, had been systematically dismantled. She was born in 1516, a cherished child, the hope of a dynasty desperate for a male heir. She was educated, accomplished, fluent in Latin, a skilled musician. Ambassadors praised her poise. For 17 years, she was the undisputed heir to the English throne. Then Anne Boleyn captured the king's heart, and the entire structure of Mary's world collapsed. The king's great matter was not just a political crisis. For Mary, it was the cataclysm that defined her existence. She was forbidden from seeing her mother, Catherine, who was banished from court and held in a state of gilded house arrest. Their letters, filled with love and coded warnings, were her only solace. Catherine urged her daughter to remain steadfast, to obey God before the king. But obeying God meant defying a father who saw himself as God's chosen instrument on earth. This was the crucible in which Mary's character was forged, a furnace of fear, betrayal, and unyielding faith. When Anne Boleyn gave birth to a daughter, Elizabeth, Mary's humiliation was complete. She was stripped of her household and sent to serve in the nursery of the new princess. The former heir to the throne was now little more than a lady-in-waiting to an infant she saw as the symbol of her family's destruction. Imagine the daily torment, forced to bow to the child of the woman who had destroyed your mother and stolen your future. Every curtsy was a lie, every smile a mask. She refused to acknowledge Elizabeth's title, referring to her simply as the little bastard, an act of defiance that brought the king's wrath crashing down upon her. She was threatened, bullied, and told her life hung by a thread. The court of Henry VIII was a viper's nest where survival depended on anticipating the king's mercurial moods. One wrong word could lead to the Tower of London. And Mary, stubborn and proud, spoke many wrong words. Her very existence was an inconvenient reminder of the king's previous life, a living testament to the authority of the Pope he had rejected. Yet her Spanish blood and her connection to the most powerful man in Europe, her cousin, the Holy Roman Emperor Charles V, was her only shield. Henry knew that to execute Mary might invite an imperial invasion, so he chose psychological warfare instead. He would break her spirit, not her neck. The pressure reached its peak after Anne Boleyn herself fell from grace, executed on trumped-up charges of adultery and treason in May of 1536. For a fleeting moment, Mary must have felt a surge of hope. The witch was dead. Surely her father would restore her to his favor. But Henry's price for reconciliation was absolute submission. He presented her with the Act of Succession, a document that required her to acknowledge him as the supreme head of the Church and to accept that his marriage to Catherine of Aragon had been unlawful from the beginning. It was a devil's bargain. Signing meant betraying her mother's honor and the Catholic faith she held dear. Refusing meant almost certain death. The imperial ambassador, Eustace Chapuis, her only real ally, advised her to sign, arguing that a signature given under duress was not binding in the eyes of God. A living heretic, he reasoned, was more useful to the Catholic cause than a dead martyr. After weeks of agonizing torment, sick with fever and fearing for her life, Mary finally broke. She signed the document. In that moment, she secured her physical survival, but something inside her was irrevocably damaged. The humiliation of that submission, the knowledge that she had bent her knee to the forces that destroyed her mother, would fester within her for the rest of her life. It was a wound that never truly healed, a debt she felt she owed to God, a debt she would one day repay in fire. Her father had taught her a valuable lesson, that in the Game of Thrones, piety without power is a passport to oblivion. The Tudors didn't share the throne, they carved it out, first with the sword and then with the executioner's axe. Her submission bought her a fragile peace. She was welcomed back to court, granted a household befitting her station, and slowly a semblance of a relationship with her father was restored, but she was never truly safe. She watched as Henry cycled through 4 more wives, each marriage a new chapter in the kingdom's instability. The birth of her half-brother Edward in 1537 secured the male heir Henry had craved, but it pushed Mary further down the line of succession. She was no longer the bastard, but she was not the heir. She was a pawn, a valuable marriage prospect to be used in the diplomatic chess game of Europe. She learned to be cautious, to mask her true feelings behind a veneer of obedience. She survived her father's tyrannical reign, but the scars remained. The girl who had been raised to rule had been taught the brutal art of submission. The princess who dreamed of a crown was forced to dream only of survival. Her unwavering Catholic faith, the one thing she had almost died for, became her sanctuary and her shield. It was the last piece of her mother she had left, the unshakable core of her identity in a world that had tried to erase it. This faith, however, would soon face an even greater test, a new kind of persecution that would make her father's reign seem almost tolerant by comparison. A terrifying choice for a young woman. What do you think was her greater guide through these dark years? Her royal blood or her unshakable faith? Tell me in the comments below. Her father's death in 1547 brought not relief, but a new and more insidious danger. The crown passed to her 9-year-old half-brother, Edward VI, a frail boy who was a fervent, almost fanatical Protestant. Real power, however, fell into the hands of a council of regents, ambitious men determined to transform England into a truly Protestant state, a New Jerusalem, cleansed of the popish superstition that Mary embodied. For Mary, this was not just a political shift, it was a declaration of war on her soul. The years of survival under her father had been a constant, low-grade terror. The reign of her brother became a spy drama, with Mary as the prime target of a regime that saw her as the leader of a Catholic fifth column. She was no longer just the king's displaced daughter. She was the hope of all those who clung to the old faith, a living symbol of resistance. The Lord Protector, the Duke of Somerset, and later the more radical Duke of Northumberland, saw her not as family, but as a political problem to be managed and, if necessary, eliminated. Their agents watched her every move. Her household at Kenninghall in Norfolk became an island of Catholicism in a sea of aggressive reform. While the rest of England saw its ancient churches stripped of statues, its stained glass smashed, and its Latin Mass replaced by the plain English of the new Book of Common Prayer, Mary openly defied the government. She continued to have Mass celebrated in her private chapel, a blatant act of disobedience. This was not just piety, it was a political statement. Every sung Kyrie was an act of defiance. Could you send your own family to prison for their beliefs if you truly thought you were acting in the name of progress? For Edward's council, the answer was a resounding yes. They could not tolerate such open rebellion, especially from the heir presumptive. They summoned her to London for questioning. Imagine the scene, the 30-something princess standing before a council of powerful men who had been her father's servants, being lectured like a disobedient schoolgirl. They demanded she abandon the Mass. She refused. She argued that she was bound by the laws her father had made, laws they were now dismantling. It was a masterful piece of political theatre. She was using her father's legacy, the very thing that had tormented her, as a shield against his successors. But her greatest protection remained her cousin, the Emperor Charles V. The Emperor made it clear to the English government that any harm that came to Mary, or any infringement on her right to worship, would have severe diplomatic and economic consequences. England, a relatively minor power, could not afford to antagonize the ruler of the vast Holy Roman Empire. So began a tense standoff. The council would pressure Mary, arrest her chaplains, and threaten her household. The imperial ambassador would protest, rattle his saber, and the council would reluctantly back down. Mary was playing a dangerous game, balancing on a knife's edge between her conscience and the law. She wasn't a passive victim waiting for deliverance. She was an active player in the high-stakes politics of the Reformation. She learned to dissemble, to negotiate, to use her international connections as a weapon. Her letters to the emperor are a masterclass in political maneuvering, portraying herself as a damsel in distress while simultaneously directing a sophisticated resistance movement. The young king, her brother, was her most zealous opponent. Raised by Protestant tutors, Edward saw his older sister as a spiritual contamination. In their personal confrontations, he was not a loving brother but a stern inquisitor. He wept with frustration at her idolatry, begging her to see the true light of the gospel. He saw it as his divine duty to save her soul, whether she wanted it or not. For Mary, it was yet another betrayal by a family member in the name of religion. Her father had declared her a bastard to get a new wife. Her brother was now threatening her freedom to save her from a faith he considered heresy. The pressure was immense. At one point, a plan was even hatched for her to escape England, to flee across the Channel to the safety of the Emperor's court. A ship waited for her on the coast. But at the last moment, she hesitated. Fleeing would mean abandoning her claim to the throne, betraying her supporters in England who saw her as their future salvation. She chose to stay and fight. It was a decision that would change the course of English history. She chose the path of a potential martyr or a potential queen. The regime grew more radical. The Duke of Northumberland, who ousted Somerset to become the new Lord President of the Council, was a man of boundless ambition and zero religious conviction, though he posed as a pious Protestant. He saw Mary as the single greatest threat to his power. If the sickly Edward were to die, Mary would become queen, and his Protestant revolution, along with his own head, would be finished. He knew he had to prevent her from ever reaching the throne. The air in the kingdom grew thick with conspiracy. As Edward's health began to fail in the spring of 1553, Northumberland initiated his final, desperate gambit. He persuaded the dying king to write a new will, a device for the succession, that would disinherit both his sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, and pass the crown to their cousin, the Protestant Lady Jane Grey. Lady Jane was conveniently married to Northumberland's own son. It was a nakedly self-serving coup d'etat dressed in the robes of religious piety. Northumberland was not just trying to save Protestantism, he was trying to create a Tudor-Dudley dynasty. Mary, kept informed by a network of spies, knew that the moment her brother died, her life would be in immediate danger. The Protestant cage she had lived in for 6 years was about to become a tomb, but Northumberland had made a fatal miscalculation. He had underestimated Mary. He had underestimated the English people's loyalty to the Tudor line, and he had underestimated the powerful legacy of resentment that his own radical reforms had created. The country was a powder keg, and Mary Tudor was about to light the fuse. The trap was set. In the early summer of 1553, as King Edward VI lay dying, the Duke of Northumberland summoned Mary to London, claiming her brother wished to see her one last time. It was a lie. The real plan was to lure her to the capital, where she could be easily arrested and confined to the Tower of London the moment the king's death was announced. Power in the 16th century was about physical control. Control the heir, and you control the succession. Mary was riding towards London when a secret message reached her. A warning sent by loyal supporters at court, revealing Northumberland's true intentions. The king was dead, and the Duke was coming for her. A race against time began. In that moment, Mary had to make a choice that would define her. She could flee to the coast and seek refuge with her cousin, the Emperor. Or she could stand and fight for the throne she believed was hers, by birthright and by God's will. The persecuted princess chose to become a warrior queen. She wheeled her horse around and galloped east, towards the friendly territory of East Anglia, a conservative region with strong Catholic sympathies. It was an act of incredible audacity. A lone woman, with only a small retinue of household servants, was challenging the entire machinery of the state. Northumberland, now in control of London, the Treasury and the army, proclaimed Lady Jane Grey as the new Queen of England. The 17-year-old Jane, a pawn in her father-in-law's power game, was a queen against her will, reigning for a mere 9 days. While London watched this puppet show with a mixture of confusion and resentment, Mary was rallying an army. She sent letters to the nobles, to the towns, to anyone who would listen, calling on them to defend the true Tudor succession against the ambition of a traitor. Her appeal was not just about religion, it was about legitimacy, about law, and about the deep-seated English belief in the rightful line of inheritance. The response was astonishing. People flocked to her banner. Gentry, farmers, merchants, they came in droves, bringing their own weapons and their fierce loyalty. An army of thousands materialized around her as if from nowhere. The Tudors had a mystique, a connection with the common people that Northumberland, for all his power, could not replicate. He had the government, but Mary had the heart of the country. The drama played out like a military thriller. Northumberland, forced to leave London to confront Mary's growing forces, made a critical error. He placed himself at the head of the army, a move that took him away from the center of power. As he marched north, support for his cause began to crumble. His own soldiers were deserting, muttering that they would not fight for a traitor against King Henry's daughter. The fleet, sent to blockade the coast and prevent Mary from escaping, mutinied and declared for her. In London, the Privy Council, seeing which way the wind was blowing, staged a counter-coup. They abandoned the unfortunate Queen Jane and proclaimed Mary as the rightful queen. The 9-day reign was over. When the news reached Northumberland's army near Cambridge, it simply melted away. The great Duke found himself abandoned, a general with no soldiers. He was arrested in a tavern, a pathetic end to a grandiose ambition. Mary's entry into London on the 3rd of August, 1553, was a moment of absolute triumph. The city erupted in celebration. Crowds cheered, bells rang, and wine flowed in the streets. She was 37 years old, and for the first time in her life, she was not a victim, but a victor. She had achieved the impossible, seizing her crown not by inheritance, but by a popular uprising. Riding beside her was her half-sister, Elizabeth, a strategic display of Tudor unity. But behind the celebrations, the grim business of power had already begun. The first executions followed swiftly. The Duke of Northumberland, along with several of his key co-conspirators, was beheaded on Tower Hill. Mary showed a degree of clemency at first. She spared the life of Lady Jane Grey, recognizing her as a tragic pawn. But she had learned her father's lesson well. Mercy to traitors is cruelty to the state. The throne she had won was far from secure. She was a Catholic queen in a country whose political establishment was now overwhelmingly Protestant. The men who ran her government, who sat on her council, were the same men who had served her brother and tried to disinherit her. She had won the battle for the crown, but the war for England's soul was just beginning. And to fight that war, she believed she needed two things: to restore the true faith and to secure the succession with a Catholic heir. To get an heir, she needed a husband. Her choice of husband would prove to be one of the most disastrous decisions of her reign. In winning one war, she had inadvertently started another, a war not just for the loyalty of her people, but for the heart of a foreign king and the very future of England itself. She had no idea that her greatest triumph would lead directly to her greatest tragedy, sparking a bloody rebellion that would nearly tear her kingdom apart. The moment Queen Mary announced her intention to marry Philip, the Prince of Spain, and heir to the vast Habsburg dominions, a wave of shock and xenophobia swept across England. To the English, Spain was a rival power, a symbol of Catholic fanaticism and the dreaded Inquisition. The idea of a Spanish king sitting on the English throne was unthinkable. It conjured images of foreign domination, of England becoming a mere satellite in a sprawling Spanish empire. Parliament sent a deputation begging her on their knees to reconsider, to marry an Englishman, to keep the throne English. But Mary was resolute. Why? This was not just a political alliance. For her, it was a divine mission. Philip was the son of her cousin and staunchest defender, the Emperor Charles V. A Spanish marriage would cement England's return to the Catholic fold, a grand alliance of faith against the rising tide of Protestant heresy in Europe. On a personal level, it was also a desperate grasp at happiness. At 37, she was a lonely, unmarried woman, starved of affection for most of her life. She dreamed of a husband and, most importantly, a Catholic heir who would secure her legacy and prevent her Protestant sister, Elizabeth, from ever undoing her work. She fell in love with a portrait, with the idea of the handsome, pious Catholic prince who would be her partner in restoring God's kingdom. But her subjects saw not a savior, but a conqueror. The marriage treaty was carefully drafted to protect English sovereignty. Philip would be king in title only, with no real power, and any child of the union would inherit the English throne, but not the Spanish one. But these legal assurances did little to quell the public's fear and outrage. It was in this climate of nationalistic panic that a major rebellion erupted in the winter of 1554. Led by a Kentish knight, Sir Thomas Wyatt the Younger, the uprising was a direct response to the Spanish match. Wyatt and his co-conspirators planned a four-pronged assault on London, intending to depose Mary and, most likely, place her sister Elizabeth on the throne, marrying her to an English nobleman. The plot was a chaotic mix of aristocratic ambition and popular fury. While the other parts of the rebellion fizzled out, Wyatt's force in Kent proved formidable. Thousands of men, terrified of a Spanish takeover, joined his cause. He marched on London, the capital city, holding its breath. This was a direct threat to Mary's life and crown, far more dangerous than Northumberland's clumsy coup. The royal army sent to stop Wyatt deserted, with many soldiers shouting, "We are all Englishmen," and joining the rebels. The situation was critical. Panic gripped the court. Advisors begged the Queen to flee London, to escape to the safety of Windsor Castle. But Mary refused. This was the moment she showed the world she was her father's daughter. She demonstrated a raw, unflinching courage that stunned her enemies. She rode to the Guildhall in the heart of London and delivered the speech of her life. Standing before the city's leaders, she was not a frightened woman, but a defiant queen. She appealed to their loyalty, their courage, their Englishness. She declared that she was married to her kingdom and that she would not endanger it with a marriage her people truly opposed, but she would not be dictated to by rebels. It was a masterful performance, a rally cry that galvanized the city. Londoners, who had little love for the Spanish marriage, had even less love for armed rebellion. They rallied to their queen. The city gates were shut, barricades were erected, and the citizens of London prepared to defend their homes. Wyatt's rebels reached the outskirts of the city but found it sealed against them. After a desperate and bloody skirmish at Ludgate, the rebellion collapsed. Wyatt was captured and the uprising was over. The aftermath was brutal. Mary's brief period of clemency was over. Wyatt's rebellion had terrified her, hardening her resolve and fueling a deep-seated paranoia. The retribution was swift and savage. Hundreds of rebels were hanged. Wyatt and other leaders were tortured for confessions and then publicly executed. The most prominent suspect, however, was her own sister. Was Elizabeth involved? The Spanish ambassador was certain of it and demanded her head. There was no concrete proof, but Elizabeth had certainly been aware of the plot. She was the rebellion's figurehead, the great Protestant hope. A terrified Elizabeth was arrested and taken by barge to the Tower of London, entering through the infamous Traitor's Gate. She fully expected to die. Mary was now faced with a terrible choice. Her counsellors, her husband-to-be, her own fear, all screamed for Elizabeth's execution. A living Elizabeth would always be a magnet for conspiracy, but to kill her own sister on suspicion alone was a step too far, even for a Tudor. Perhaps she remembered her own terror in that same situation. Perhaps she lacked the final piece of evidence. For weeks, Elizabeth's fate hung in the balance. In the end, Mary spared her life, but kept her under strict house arrest, a prisoner in all but name. The rebellion was crushed, but it left deep scars. It proved to Mary that her Protestant subjects were treacherous and could not be trusted. It convinced her that only the most severe measures would suffice to cleanse her kingdom of heresy. The failure of the rebellion paradoxically sealed the fate of the Spanish marriage and paved the way for a far bloodier chapter in her reign. The fires of rebellion had been extinguished, but they would soon be replaced by the fires of religious persecution. Mary crushed the rebellion, but at what cost? Was her ruthless response a sign of a strong ruler securing her throne, or a paranoid tyrant lashing out in fear? Let me know what you think. With the rebellion crushed and her throne secured by force, Mary turned to her life's great mission, the spiritual reunification of England with Rome. For her, this was not a matter of policy, but of salvation. She believed with every fibre of her being that her father's break with the Church and her brother's Protestant experiment had damned the souls of her people. She had been chosen by God to lead her flock back to the one true faith. Her methods, however, would earn her an infamous name for all time. In late 1554, Cardinal Reginald Pole, the papal legate, arrived in England, and in a grand ceremony he absolved the kingdom of its long years of schism. The old heresy laws from the Middle Ages were revived. These laws made it a crime, punishable by death, to deny the core tenets of the Catholic faith, particularly the doctrine of transubstantiation, the belief that the bread and wine of the Eucharist literally become the body and blood of Christ. At first, the goal was to persuade, to re-educate. But when persuasion failed, the state turned to coercion. The fires began to burn in February of 1555. The first to die was John Rogers, a biblical translator and Protestant cleric. He was burned at the stake at Smithfield, a marketplace just outside the walls of London that would soon become synonymous with horror. The government intended these public executions to be terrifying spectacles, a form of shock therapy for a heretical nation. They believed that the sight of a few prominent heretics burning would frighten the rest of the population into submission and conformity. They were catastrophically wrong. Instead of terror, the burnings often inspired defiance. The victims went to their deaths with extraordinary courage, singing psalms as the flames licked at their feet, praying for their executioners. They became heroes, martyrs for their faith. Their suffering was not a deterrent, it was a powerful piece of propaganda for the Protestant cause. Could you send hundreds of people to the stake, sincerely believing you are saving their souls? For Mary and her government, the answer was yes. They were not sadists. In their worldview, heresy was a spiritual disease, a cancer on the body politic. A heretic who refused to recant was not only damning themselves, but was also a threat to the salvation of the entire community. Burning the body was a terrible necessity to save the soul of the nation, and perhaps even the soul of the heretic, who might repent at the last moment. The machinery of persecution ground on relentlessly. Across the country, ordinary men and women were dragged before church courts. Weavers, artisans, farmers, housewives, people who had embraced the New English Bible and the simpler Protestant faith were now forced to choose. They were interrogated about their beliefs on the nature of communion. If their answers were deemed heretical, they were given a chance to recant, to rejoin the Catholic Church. Those who refused were handed over to the secular authorities to be burned. The stories of the martyrs became the stuff of legend. Two of the most famous were the bishops Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley, who were burned together at Oxford. As the fire was lit, the elderly Latimer famously cried out to his companion, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle, by God's grace, in England, as I trust shall never be put out." He was right. That candle became an inferno of anti-Catholic sentiment that would burn for centuries. The highest profile victim was Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, who had annulled Mary's parents' marriage and had been the architect of the English Reformation. Broken by imprisonment, Cranmer signed several recantations denouncing his Protestant faith. By law, this should have saved him. But Mary wanted a public spectacle of humiliation. She decreed he would still be burned, but would first have to read his recantation to the crowd. But on the day of his execution, Cranmer pulled off a final stunning act of defiance. Instead of reading his recantation, he renounced it, proclaiming the Pope to be the Antichrist. Then, as he was brought to the stake, he thrust the hand that had signed the recantations into the fire first, saying, "Forasmuch as my hand offended, writing contrary to my heart, my hand shall first be punished, therefore." It was a moment of supreme theatrical martyrdom that utterly destroyed the government's intended propaganda victory. In total, nearly 300 people, men, women, and even some children, were burned at the stake during Mary's 5-year reign. While this number may seem small compared to other European religious persecutions of the era, it was unprecedented in English history. The sheer concentration and public nature of the killings horrified the populace. The policy was a catastrophic failure. It did not destroy Protestantism, it forged it. It created a generation of English Protestants who defined their faith in opposition to a bloody, persecuting Catholic Church, personified by the Queen. Mary, who so desperately wanted to be loved by her people, who saw herself as their spiritual mother, was becoming a monster in their eyes. She was no longer good Queen Mary, she was becoming Bloody Mary. The tragedy is that she believed she was doing God's work, that this terrible cleansing by fire was an act of love. But in her desperate attempt to save her country's soul, she was losing its heart. While she was busy lighting pyres, her personal life, the very reason for the Spanish alliance, was beginning to unravel in a deeply personal and humiliating way. In the spring of 1555, as the first fires of Smithfield were being lit, a wave of joyful anticipation swept through the court and the country. Queen Mary, now 39 years old, was pregnant, or so it seemed. Her belly was swelling, she had ceased to menstruate, and her physicians confirmed that all the signs pointed to a royal birth. The news was a political godsend. A Catholic heir would cement the Tudor dynasty, ensure the continuation of the Catholic Restoration, and dashed the hopes of the Protestant faction that centred around her sister, Elizabeth. The kingdom prepared to celebrate. Letters were sent to European courts announcing the impending birth. Thanksgiving services were held. A magnificent cradle, once used for Mary herself, was prepared. The royal nursery was staffed. Astrologers calculated auspicious dates. Parliament even passed an act naming Philip as regent should Mary die in childbirth. Her husband, Philip of Spain, who had found his middle-aged wife and the dreary English weather equally unappealing, played the part of the expectant father. The birth of a son would be his ticket out of England, his duty done. The country held its breath. The Queen went into confinement at Hampton Court Palace in April, as was customary for a royal birth. The expected delivery date came and went. Weeks turned into a month, and then another. Rumours began to fly. Some whispered the child was already born but was weak or deformed. Others suggested it was a hoax, a pillow stuffed under the Queen's dress. The court was in a state of suspended animation, a surreal waiting game. The tension was unbearable. Mary herself remained in her chambers, praying, waiting for a sign, for the labour pains that never came. Imagine the psychological torment, the hopes of a kingdom, the future of her faith, her own desperate personal longing for a child, all resting on a birth that refused to happen. Slowly, agonizingly, the terrible truth began to dawn on the court, and then on Mary herself. There was no child. Her physicians, perhaps out of fear or incompetence, had misdiagnosed her. Her symptoms were likely the result of what is now believed to have been uterine cancer or ovarian cysts, combined with a powerful, desperate case of pseudocyesis, a phantom pregnancy. By August, the pretense could no longer be maintained. The court was quietly dismantled, the nursery staff was dismissed, the magnificent cradle was put away, the public humiliation was absolute. The Queen, who had waited her whole life for a child, had delivered nothing but a cruel illusion. For her Protestant subjects it was a sign from God. He had shown his displeasure with her bloody persecutions by making her barren. Her womb, like her reign, would bear no fruit. The personal catastrophe was devastating for Mary. It shattered her confidence and her health. Even worse, it shattered her marriage. Philip, having no reason to stay in England, packed his bags and left for the continent in August 1555. He had business to attend to. His father, the Emperor Charles, was abdicating, leaving Philip to rule over Spain and the Netherlands. He promised his heartbroken wife he would return soon. He would not be back for nearly 2 years. Mary was left alone, a barren queen, to face a resentful populace and a failing war on heresy. The burnings continued, even intensified, as if this brutal piety could somehow appease a wrathful God. But the phantom pregnancy had fundamentally weakened her authority. It made her look foolish, cursed. A queen's power in this era was intimately tied to her fertility. An empty cradle signified a dead end for her dynasty and her religious settlement. Desperate, she tried again. In 1558, the aging and increasingly ill queen once more believed she was pregnant. The cycle of hope and delusion repeated itself, though this time with a more muted, desperate air. Again, her belly swelled. Again, the court waited. And again, nothing. The second phantom pregnancy was even more pitiable than the first. It confirmed her status as a broken, barren woman, a queen whom God had seemingly abandoned. Her body had betrayed her just as her people were betraying her faith. This deeply personal tragedy of the empty cradle was the psychological core of her reign's failure. She had sacrificed her popularity for a Spanish marriage in the hope of a Catholic heir. The marriage had brought her no happiness, and the heir had proven to be a ghost. All she had left was her faith and her fires. And as her personal world crumbled, her political world was about to suffer a blow that would become the final, indelible symbol of her catastrophic reign. Philip of Spain returned to England in the spring of 1557 for one reason only. He needed England's help. He was at war with France, and he demanded that his wife bring her kingdom into the conflict on Spain's side. The English Privy Council was deeply opposed, the country was in a dire financial state, its military was weak, and there was no appetite for fighting Spain's wars. But Mary, desperate for her husband's affection and eager to prove her worth as an ally, overruled her advisors. She declared war on France in June 1557. It would prove to be the final, fatal error of her reign. The war was a disaster from the start. England was woefully unprepared. The treasury was empty, and the navy, though Mary had initiated some important reforms, was not ready for a major conflict. The English contribution to the war effort was minimal, but it placed the country in the crosshairs of a powerful and vengeful France. The French king, Henry II, saw an opportunity to strike a blow that would not only hurt Spain, but would also deeply humiliate England. He targeted Calais. Calais was England's last possession on the European mainland, a foothold in France held since the 100 Years' War over 200 years prior. It was more than a strategic port, it was a powerful symbol of English identity and past military glory. Its loss would be unthinkable, a national disgrace. But the unthinkable was about to happen. The English government, complacent and distracted, had left the fortress dangerously under-garrisoned. They believed it was impregnable, especially in winter. In January of 1558, the French army, under the command of the brilliant Duke of Guise, launched a surprise winter campaign. They swept through the outer defences of Calais with stunning speed. The English garrison, outnumbered and caught completely off guard, put up a brave but hopeless fight. After a siege of less than a month, Calais surrendered. The news struck England like a thunderclap. The shock and outrage were immense. For 2 centuries, Calais had been a piece of England on French soil. It was the jewel in the crown of English foreign policy, and it had been lost in a matter of weeks, squandered in a pointless war fought for a Spanish king. The blame fell squarely on the Queen. Her catastrophic marriage had brought no love, no heir, and had now resulted in this ultimate national humiliation. The loss of Calais shattered what little remained of Mary's prestige. It was the final nail in the coffin of her reign. She was already physically sick, suffering from what was likely stomach cancer, and this blow seemed to break her spirit completely. It is said that she fell into a deep depression, famously telling her ladies-in-waiting, "When I am dead and opened, you shall find Calais and Philip lying in my heart." Whether she actually said those words is uncertain, but they perfectly encapsulate the twin disasters of her reign, her failed marriage and her failed foreign policy. The war with France was a humiliation, the religious persecutions were a failure, and her body had betrayed her with false hopes of an heir. She was a queen of ashes. All her desperate attempts to restore England to a perceived former glory, a Catholic nation, a European power, had backfired spectacularly. She had dragged the country back to Rome, only to make Catholicism hated. She had married the most powerful prince in Christendom, only to be abandoned and lose England's most prized possession. She was now a dying queen, presiding over a broken and resentful kingdom. And as her own life faded, another star was rising. The constant, quiet threat that had lurked in the background of her entire reign was now poised to take center stage. Her heir, the one person she had every reason to fear and resent, was her own half-sister, Elizabeth. Calais was gone, and with it, England's pride. Whose fault was this ultimate humiliation? The absent husband who dragged her into his war, or the desperate queen who followed him blindly? Cast your vote. The relationship between Mary and Elizabeth was the most dangerous and delicate dance of the Tudor era. It was a duel fought not with swords, but with smiles, courtesies, and veiled threats. For 5 years, the Catholic queen and her Protestant heir circled each other in a state of mutual suspicion and necessity. Mary knew Elizabeth was a heretic in the eyes of the Church, the living symbol of her father's adulterous break with Rome, and a magnet for every Protestant conspiracy in the kingdom. Elizabeth, for her part, knew that her very survival depended on convincing her dangerously devout sister of her loyalty. It was a cat-and-mouse game where the penalty for losing was death. The moment Mary took the throne, Elizabeth became the focus of opposition. While Mary tried to turn the clock back, Elizabeth represented the future. She was young, clever, and, most importantly, she was not Mary. After Wyatt's rebellion, the pressure on Mary to eliminate her sister was immense. The Spanish ambassador, Simon Renard, relentlessly argued for Elizabeth's execution, seeing her as the single greatest obstacle to the Catholic restoration. He wrote to Philip, "So long as Elizabeth is alive, it will be very difficult to make this kingdom entirely secure." Mary had her sister imprisoned in the Tower of London, the grim fortress where their own mother, Anne Boleyn, had met her end. Every day, Elizabeth expected to face the executioner's block. She was subjected to intense interrogations, her servants were arrested and questioned, but her enemies could never find the one piece of damning evidence, the one letter that definitively linked her to Wyatt's treason. Elizabeth was far too cunning for that. She had learned the art of survival in the treacherous courts of her father and brother. She protested her innocence with a passion and intelligence that gave Mary pause. Was it a flicker of sisterly affection, a memory of the oath she swore to her mother, Catherine, to care for her family? Or was it cold political calculation? Mary understood that executing a popular heir on mere suspicion, without a public trial and irrefutable proof, could spark another, even more dangerous rebellion. So, she hesitated. Elizabeth was spared the axe, but was sent into a comfortable but heavily guarded exile at Woodstock Manor. She was a prisoner, spied on, her visitors monitored. Yet even from her gilded cage, her shadow loomed large over Mary's reign. Every failed policy, every unpopular decision, only made Elizabeth more popular. Every Protestant burned at the stake created more secret supporters for the Protestant princess. As Mary's health declined and her hopes for an heir faded, Elizabeth's position grew stronger. The dynamic between them was a masterclass in psychological warfare. They would have tense, stilted meetings where every word was laden with double meaning. Mary would press Elizabeth on her religious beliefs, trying to trap her into a heretical statement. Elizabeth would respond with brilliantly ambiguous answers. When asked her opinion on the presence of Christ in the sacrament, a deadly question, she is said to have replied, "Christ was the word that spake it. He took the bread and brake it, and what his words did make it, that I believe and take it." It was an answer so cleverly evasive that it was impossible to condemn. She played the part of the dutiful younger sister, the obedient subject, all the while knowing that time was on her side. Philip of Spain, ironically, became one of her protectors. After it became clear Mary would have no children, Philip realized that the alternative to Elizabeth as heir was not a more suitable Catholic, but Mary, Queen of Scots. The Scottish queen was betrothed to the heir of France, England's traditional enemy. Philip would rather see the heretic Elizabeth on the English throne than see his French rivals control England, Scotland, and France. Politics makes strange bedfellows. The dying queen was now in a terrible bind. To name Elizabeth as her successor was to admit the complete and utter failure of her life's work. It meant handing her passionately restored Catholic kingdom over to a Protestant who would surely dismantle everything she had built. To try and exclude her would be to defy the will of her own father, Henry VIII, and to plunge the kingdom into a bloody civil war upon her death. In her final days, racked with illness and despair, Mary was forced to confront this reality. She tried to extract a promise from Elizabeth that she would maintain the Catholic faith. Elizabeth gave her a typically vague and reassuring answer. In the end, with no other choice, Mary reluctantly acknowledged Elizabeth as her rightful heir. On the 17th of November, 1558, Mary Tudor died. The news reached Elizabeth at Hatfield House, where she was sitting under an oak tree, Upon hearing she was now queen, she reportedly fell to her knees and quoted the Bible in Latin. "Ad dominum factum est istud, et est mirabile in oculis nostris." This is the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. The deadly dance was over. Elizabeth had won. She had outlasted, outwitted, and outlived her sister. But Mary's death was not the end of her story. In many ways, it was the beginning of a second posthumous execution, the systematic destruction of her reputation, and the creation of a myth that would overshadow her true history for the next 500 years. The moment Mary's body was cold, the machinery of propaganda whirred into life. The new regime of Queen Elizabeth I understood that to secure its own legitimacy and the future of Protestantism in England, it needed to do more than just change laws. It needed to win the battle for history. It needed to create a narrative, a story that would cast the previous reign as a dark, bloody, and foreign-dominated nightmare from which Elizabeth, the glorious new Protestant queen, had delivered the nation. Mary's memory had to be cursed so that the golden age of Elizabeth could shine all the brighter in comparison. The chief architect of this black legend was a man named John Foxe. An exiled Protestant scholar during Mary's reign, Foxe returned to England and set about compiling a monumental work of Protestant propaganda. Actes and Monuments, better known as Foxe's Book of Martyrs. First published in 1563, it was a massive, sprawling account of the persecution of Protestants, not just in Mary's England, but throughout Christian history. But its heart and its most sensational chapters were dedicated to the Marian martyrs. Foxe and his team of researchers collected first-hand accounts, eyewitness testimonies, and letters from the victims of the burnings. The book was filled with lurid details of suffering and heroic defiance. But it was more than just a history. It was a Protestant epic, a story of good versus evil, of saints versus demonic Catholic persecutors. And at the center of this web of cruelty was the figure of Bloody Mary. What made the book so powerful was its illustrations. It was filled with dramatic woodcuts depicting the gruesome details of the executions, believers praying in the flames, evil-looking Catholic bishops directing the proceedings. In an age when much of the population was illiterate, these images were incredibly powerful. They burned the image of a cruel, fanatical Mary into the public consciousness. Foxe's Book of Martyrs became a national bestseller, second only to the Bible in its reach and influence. It was placed in cathedrals, parish churches, and university halls by order of the government. For generations of English men and women, this book was their primary source of information about Mary's reign. It shaped a national identity built on anti-Catholicism and the idea of England as a chosen Protestant nation, perpetually under threat from foreign Catholic powers. The propaganda was relentless and effective. Any potential positives of Mary's reign were systematically ignored or suppressed. Few remembered that she had been a popular and courageous leader during her seizure of the throne. Historians now point to significant achievements during her 5 years in power. She initiated crucial reforms of the Navy that laid the groundwork for the fleet that would later defeat the Spanish Armada. Her government undertook a major overhaul of the tax and customs system, shoring up the Crown's finances after the disastrous reigns of her father and brother. She planned a recoinage that would have stabilized the currency, a plan that Elizabeth later implemented and took credit for. But none of this mattered. History is not just what happened, it's what people are told happened. The story that was told was one of failure, fanaticism, and foreign humiliation. She was the Spanish pawn who lost Calais. She was the barren queen who produced no heir. Above all, she was the bloody tyrant who burned good English patriots for their faith. This image was incredibly useful for Elizabeth's long reign. It served as a constant reminder of the alternative, a bogeyman to frighten her subjects into loyalty. Every Catholic plot against Elizabeth, real or imagined, was seen as another attempt to drag England back to the dark days of Bloody Mary. The myth became more powerful than the reality. It was a simple, compelling story that served the political needs of the victors. Mary Tudor, the historical figure, a complex, determined, and ultimately tragic woman, was erased, replaced by a one-dimensional caricature, a monster from a Protestant horror story. She became a cautionary tale, a ghost to haunt the English imagination. But is that the whole story? Can a human being, a queen who believed she was acting out of love for God and her people, be reduced to a simple label? To understand Mary, we must look behind the mask of the monster and try to find the woman. To judge the past by the standards of the present is a fool's errand. To truly understand Mary Tudor, we cannot see her through the lens of modern liberalism or religious tolerance. We must see her in the context of her own violent, dogmatic, and unforgiving age. In the 16th century, religious unity was not a matter of preference. It was considered the very foundation of a stable state. A ruler's primary duty was to maintain the one true faith. Heresy was not a private matter of conscience. It was treason against God and a disease that threatened to tear society apart. In this, Mary was no different from her contemporaries. Her father, Henry VIII, executed dozens for heresy, both Catholics who denied his supremacy and radical Protestants he considered too extreme. Her sister, Elizabeth, while more pragmatic, presided over a system that executed Catholic priests as traitors. Across Europe, in Spain, France, and the Netherlands, thousands were killed in the name of religious conformity. Mary's burnings were not unique in their cruelty, but they were unique for England in their intensity and scale. So why is she remembered as Bloody Mary, while they are not? The answer, as we've seen, lies in propaganda. She lost the war of the narrative, but there is a deeper truth to be found, a psychological truth rooted in her own life story. The tragedy of Mary Tudor is not that she was uniquely evil, but that her personal trauma became state policy. Her entire life was a battle for her faith and her legitimacy, two concepts that were fused in her mind. Her father's rejection of her mother and the Catholic Church was not just a political act, it was the source of her deepest personal wound. Restoring the authority of the Pope was, for her, a way of posthumously vindicating her beloved mother, of righting the great injustice that had defined her youth. Every Protestant who rejected the authority of the Church was, in her eyes, siding with the forces that had declared her a bastard and her mother a whore. It was personal. Could her cruelty have been a form of projection? Was she, in some sense, punishing these heretics for the pain her father had inflicted on her? We can never truly know, but it is impossible to separate the Queen's public acts from her private suffering. Her desperate desire for a child was not just about securing a dynasty. It was a longing for the love and family she had been denied, a hope that she could create the stable, happy home she never had. The phantom pregnancies were not just a political humiliation, they were a profound personal tragedy, a final cruel trick played by a god she had tried so desperately to serve. She was a woman of immense courage and conviction. She faced down Northumberland's coup and Wyatt's rebellion with a bravery that commanded respect. She was principled, loyal to her friends, and, by the standards of her time, genuinely pious. But her virtues were also her flaws. Her unwavering conviction bled into fanaticism. Her loyalty to her husband and her faith blinded her to the political realities of her kingdom. She ruled with her heart, not her head, and her heart was full of scars. She was a medieval queen forced to rule a country on the cusp of the modern world. She tried to impose a world of religious certainty onto a people who were beginning to question everything. The story of Mary Tudor is a profound and disturbing lesson in how personal pain can be magnified into public cruelty. She was not born a monster, she was made one, forged in the fires of her family's ambition, her father's tyranny, and her own unshakable tragic faith. She sincerely believed she was a physician healing her country's soul, but her cure was poison. History has condemned her, but perhaps it is possible to understand her. She was a product of a cruel world and an even crueler family, a queen who inherited a poisoned chalice and drank from it to the bitter end. Her reign was short, her legacy eternal. But who was she truly? Was Mary a monster, a religious zealot who bathed England in fire? Or was she a victim, a pawn of her father's ambition and a prisoner of her own grief? The verdict of history is never final. Now it's your turn to judge. Leave your choice in the comments.